Hello and welcome back to the fourth and final part of my Charlotte Open recap series. And in this episode, we have rounds 6 and 7, final day of the tournament. And going into this final day, I had 3 points out of 5. Not great, but I was still optimistic that I could win my last two games, finish on 5 out of 7, which wouldn't be too bad. And so for this round, I was paired against a 1900, but an underrated 1900. His chess.com blitz rating is around about 2200, I found. And he played e4. I played d6, d4 knight f6, my line defense. And here I was expecting some setup with maybe knight f3, bishop e2, which is what I saw he played the most. But he decided to play bishop e3. And so I play e5. And typically what white will do in this kind of setup is they'll play f3. And then they'll play something like queen d2 and long castle. And it's a very sharp game where white will try to storm the pawns on the king side, and I'm going to storm the pawns on the queen side. And just a very interesting kind of sharp battle. But he went for d5, which a move I note to be a little bit inaccurate here because white is kind of locking the structure but releasing a lot of tension in the center. And so I just developed my bishop, he plays f3, and now I play c6, challenging his central pawn. Not something that white ever wants to take because this would help me to control the d5 square, and it gives me access to the open b file. And already here, black is a little bit better. He played bishop c4 though, trying to say that, okay, if you take the pawn, I will take back, and my bishop will be open. So here I just castled. And he played queen e2, a move that I thought was a little bit strange because if he's putting his queen on e2, then what is he going to do with the knight? Like, I think it would have been a little bit more sensible to play queen d2 and then move the knight to e2. But he goes queen e2, and I said, okay, you know what? Let's make some trades and open things up a little bit. So I took again, and then played knight f6, hitting his bishop, and he doesn't want to lose his bishop, so he drops back. And so now we have basically this like Najdorf structure with the pawns on d6 and e5. And already I was pretty happy with my position here. I played a6, trying to expand on the queen side. He long castled, and I played b5. And now he plays queen d2. And we can kind of see the problem with why he played queen e2 earlier, because the queen would have been better on d2 to begin with. So he kind of had to waste the move just to bring it back. And I'm like, okay, a5. I'm going to just storm you on the queen side. I mean, the idea here is that he's going to try to attack me on the king side, but he's nowhere close to doing it yet, whereas I have the semblance of an attack already. I have these pawns which I'm going to push and try to weaken his king or his queen side. And so in order to not get his bishop trapped, he played a4. And around this moment, I started to spend some time because I realized that I'm off to an awfully good start, but I want to still be precise, and I want to find the best way to kind of attack him. And so at this moment, I had a few things that I was considering. So the first is just to take the pawn. And I could try to take and then play bishop d7, or I could play bishop e6. I could also play b4. But I didn't really like this move because I do control the c3 square. That's the part that I did like. I stop him from getting his knight to c3. And I thought maybe I'd do something like this. But, I thought that this structure is actually pretty hard for me to break because, I can take the open c file, but he can tuck his king away. And how am I going to break through these pawns? It's not so obvious. So I said, okay, there's got to be something a little bit better. What if I actually play bishop e6 here? This is a move that I consider. This is a very kind of risky approach because I'm actually sacrificing a pawn. He can take and then take. But I thought, okay, he can win that pawn, but now my a pawn is clear, and I can probably win this pawn back. But then I thought maybe he plays queen d3, and am I going to win it back? It's not going to be so easy. Maybe I can play like queen b7, and then bring this rook over, but then he comes in with the knight, so that's all a little bit too fancy. So after spending about 13 minutes, I actually eventually decided just to take the pawn. He takes the bishop. And again, I was considering playing bishop d7, with the idea being that if he drops back, I'm going to start rushing the pawn forward. And if he trades, then I'm going to, again, start advancing and start to kind of break through. But he can, obviously he doesn't want to take, so he can just play b3. And my pawn looks like it's getting very close to queening, but he'll put his king here. And if he puts his king on a1, his king is going to be actually quite safe. So again, I kind of thought that this was not the best way to go. I said, okay, let's play bishop e6 instead and dominate this open diagonal, which he has vacated with his bishop. And so I was expecting maybe something like knight e2, and then I'm going to start to put rooks on the c and b files and start to put pressure on him, as well as the move d5, which I also thought could be pretty good here, because this move activates my bishop, which is kind of my problem piece in this setup. It's kind of locked away at present. And so he recognized that, and he played, I think, a pretty smart move, bishop g5. Idea being that he wants to get rid of this knight, and if he does so, then it's going to make it harder for me to break with d5. Like, for example, let's say rook b8. Well, actually, he's threatening to even win a pawn here, because his now rook and queen are connected, and he can take. Now, would it be that big of a deal for me to lose the pawn? Probably not, because it frees my bishop anyway, but just something to be aware of. And now, again, at this moment, I spent a lot of time, 20 minutes to be precise, actually. I went from hour 20 to just over an hour calculating d5. And I eventually decided to play it. But there were a lot of things that I had to make sure worked for this move to be played. First of which is bishop takes knight, because it looks like he can just win a pawn. But this doesn't work for white, because there's a very critical move here that I can play. Bishop g5, skewering his queen and king, or pinning the queen rather to the king, and white is losing. They can take the bishop, but we get this position where I have a queen for a bishop and a knight, much better for black. Then he can also take, after which I would have taken with the knight, and then we would get this trade, and then I have to also watch out for this fork, where he hits my rook, and he hits the knight, but I can move the rook, and actually there's a very cool variation that I calculated. He can take the pawn, but then I have check. If he moves the king to b1, I have a very nice tactic here. Knight check, and I take the rook, and it actually ends in mate. And if he blocks the queen, it looks like that covers white, but see if you can find the very nice winning move here for black. In this position, it looks like, I have to either move the queen or trade, but I can play knight c3. Just an amazing move. If he takes the knight, I take his queen, and then I can even pin the rook and win it. And if he takes the queen on g5, then rook takes d1 is mate. So basically, he has to be very careful in this position because he's behind in development, and my pieces are starting to get activated. But he, in this position, played bishop c6, which I had foreseen, and I actually spent a lot of time making sure that I would still be fine if he played this move. I played rook c8, he takes, I take. Again, he can't take the knight because then I take the bishop and, once again, pin him down this way. But he played bishop takes e7, and, originally I was going to take with the knight, and we would get a position like this where we had some trades. He moves the bishop back, and probably I'm a little bit better here because I just have the lead in development. But I figured that with so few pieces left, the lead in development is no longer so important because am I going to checkmate him with these pieces that I have? No. Can I maybe get them into decent positions and put him under pressure? Yeah, but I thought that this is like too close to a draw, and I really wanted to punish him for kind of misplaying the opening and giving me such a lead in development. So I actually calculated for another, 5-10 minutes and took with the queen. Now this was a big risk on my part because I'm allowing him to take the knight, but the idea is that I now play this move and I pin the bishop to his queen, and he's not going to be able to save the bishop. He can, though, take the pawn, which he did, but now I have this move. Again, putting pressure on his queen, and I'm going to win the bishop back. He could actually sack his queen here. I actually considered that he might do this, but then I would move the queen out of the way, take the bishop, and we get this interesting position where it's queen and rook and 4 pawns versus 2 rooks, a knight, and 5 pawns. So mathematically even, but if I were him, I would also be hesitant to go for this because you never want to be in a position where you're playing against the queen. Just a very daunting task to defend against. So he decided to move his queen, and he has to be very careful because, for example, queen b4 looks like it pins my rook to my queen, but it allows a little tactic, and I win the queen. So he put his queen on b6, which I thought was smart because it kind of maintains pressure against both of my rooks. And here I took the bishop, he develops his knight, and now I shifted over to the c file. To put pressure on the pawn, he plays knight c3, attacking the bishop, I draw back. And so we have this position after 24 moves where it's about even. I had a slight advantage, but I am down a pawn in this position. And the thing is, if I'm not able to kind of do something serious within the next few moves, then he's just going to consolidate, and I'm not really going to have an advantage. So I was a little bit frustrated that I kind of didn't get more out of the position by this point, especially because at this point he had an hour and 15 minutes. I had only about 40 minutes. So I had already a huge time deficit compared to him, and the position is still very complicated. So there's going to be a lot of time to burn on decisions going forward. Here he played queen d6, offering a trade of queens and actually setting a trap. He obviously wanted to trade the queens because the endgame will be a lot more pleasant for him up a pawn. And I can't just move my queen, for example, to a7 because that allows back rank checkmate. I would have to take, and this would be mate. So I moved my queen to g5 with check, but he covered, and I went back. Because, again, I don't want to trade queens. And I thought for a minute that maybe he'll repeat. Maybe he'll go back to d6 and, like, do I want to put my queen on e8? Not really. But he decided to play queen e3. So I'm like, okay, he wants to, play for the win, then all right. I play h6 just to eliminate any back rank troubles. And he played king d2. So he recognized that he was already under danger. He's under a lot of pressure on the queen side, even though he has two connected pass pawns. But he's not going to get to move them if his king is right behind him. So he plays king d2. And so I started to put him under pressure. Queen b7, hitting the pawn on b2. Bishop f5, making it so that if he moves the king, the c2 pawn is going to be weak. He defends it. I come into the queen, and at this point, I had not a lot of time. I had like 30 minutes, but I'm like, all right, I'm just going to keep him under constant pressure and try to bait him into blundering. Try to bait him into weakening his position somehow. I force him to play h3. I drop back with the rook, and my idea was that, if he gets his king to safety, I'm going to bring the rook over, and I might even at some moment, if he's not careful, like, let's say he played rook a1 here to try to extricate his rook. I have this idea to sacrifice the bishop here. Because when he takes, I'm now infiltrating with the queen and the rook, and his king is basically forced down to the open, and he's close to getting mated. Maybe I can even play like rook d8 first to prevent him from escaping. So he had to be very kind of cautious of that. He played queen f2, offering the trade of queens. Once again, I don't want to trade. I give a check. I play here rook e8 because I really wanted to break through with the e-pawn, e4. For example, if he had played rook d1 here, I think e4 is just deadly. Because if he takes, I take with the bishop, and he can't take because, the rook opens, and he's now just getting slaughtered. I'm still down a pawn, but his king is just wide open, and he's actually getting checkmated here. And if he were to, for example, play f4, try to keep things closed, I'll just shove the pawn right down his queen's face. He has to move, and that pawn is going to be super annoying now, not to mention maybe I can take this. Would be very bad to allow, but he did a good job of constantly kind of like staying one step ahead of my threats, which was very frustrating because eventually I had to decide, like, do I just repeat or do I try to just keep him under pressure? And maybe here I should have just played queen c4 and kind of just taken a draw. But I said, no, I'm going to try to keep him under pressure by moving my queen to a different square. But then he started to get his king to safety. And now his king has cover, and it's not so easy for me to attack. And suddenly he starts to activate his pieces. I decided to give up my bishop for the knight because I felt like his knight would actually be very annoying. And at this moment, I have only about 12 minutes left, and he has like 30 plus. So he's up 20 minutes on the clock and up a pawn, and he's starting to take control over the game. And he brings in his other rook. He brings in his queen. I back up. He offers a trade of queens. I obviously don't want to trade, so I sidestep. He puts his rook to block my queen from infiltrating this way. I bring the rook over. And here I made a big mistake when I allowed a trade of queens, because I missed that after queen b4, he can take and give a check. And I thought that I would just move the king, but then I realized that he has queen e4 check, and the queens get traded. So after this check hit, I was like losing it. I was so angry at myself. I was like, I just had such a good position. I'm about to blow it. I had to fight the urge just to not resign in this position. But then I thought, okay, I'm only down one pawn. Yes, I'm going to go into a rook endgame where he has two connected pawns, but I'm still going to fight. I'm not going to give him such an easy win. So I played queen back to f8, allowed the trade, and he plays f4 now, which is an interesting move, basically saying like, okay, you can take, and you can even take here, but this king and pawn endgame is winning for white, because white brings in their king, and there's not much I can do against his two connected pass pawns. You know, I could try to sacrifice my pawn, but he can always come back with his king and stop it. So I decided just to play rook d6, so that if he took, I would at least get one of his pass pawns back, but this should still be winning for white. However, he played rook e2, which I thought was a little bit weird, and I played e4 here. I'm down to only about 5 minutes, but I'm just trying to stay alive. I was happy when I got to play f5, though, because at least now I have a passed e-pawn, which is going to give him something to worry about. I brought in my king. I brought in the rook. He goes rook d2 trying to trade. I shift over this way and start to attack his pawns so that I can at least have some counterplay. Here I decided to push e3 rather than taking the pawn, because I didn't have a lot of time, but it looked to me like this was already going to lose because he can bring his rook back, and you know, he can push his pawns. I can come here, but his pawns are moving pretty quickly. But, you know, to be honest, this endgame is very hard to evaluate when you have like 3 minutes on the clock, which, again, shows my poor time management throughout this tournament, that I put myself in a position where who knows what's going to happen, but, you know, if I have time, then I might even be able to turn the tides of this endgame. But I played e3 here, and then I moved the king over, and then I took a pawn and took another pawn. So we have this position where I'm actually up a pawn now, but his pawns are moving faster. I play rook e4 now, offering a trade of rooks, because if he takes, this is actually a draw, because it's like a classic example where there's two pass pawns on opposite sides of the board, and neither king can take both pawns, and neither pawns can push past the king, so it's just a draw. He played rook d3 check, though. I moved back with the king. He played king b5, and somewhere at this point, I made a huge mistake. I'm not exactly sure where, but I had, again, like 2 minutes on the clock, and I decided to push h4. He played c5, and I pushed g5, which may have been a mistake. I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do here, because his pawns are about to push to c6, and he's going to have two pawns on the 6th rank. He's going to play b7, and eventually he's going to queen. How do I stop him from doing that? Again, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe I needed to play like a rook e5 here, but I thought, okay, maybe I can still sacrifice my rook for his two pawns somehow, and then he's going to have to still stop my 3 pawns with his rook. So I was still clinging on to some hope here. But now this is where I really messed up, because I played rook e6 check, not realizing that he can block with the rook. And now I can't take, because then he's just going to be faster. And before I get to promote, he's actually going to promote his own queen, and it's going to be over. So I played rook back to e7. He plays rook g6, threatening back rank mate. I have to bring the rook back. He goes b7. And then he goes, I actually played rook c8 because I realized I was completely lost. You know, if I play h3, he's going to actually mate me before I even get to make a queen. So I played rook c8. hoping that he would take, and the game goes on a few more moves, but he just played c6, and I resigned in this position because if I push, then once again he's going to go check, check, and checkmate. So yeah, there we have it. A very painful loss. I thought that I had a really good position out of the opening, and was a very interesting middle game where I had a chance to kind of like press for the initiative, but I really didn't find the best way to attack, I feel like, and maybe I took too many risks, and the position was very complicated. I'm sure that I missed, certain chances to do certain things, but there was just no reason to lose this game. I mean, even the end game, I probably had plenty of chances to draw it, but, because I had exhausted so much time throughout the game, I just wasn't able to spend the time in the critical moments. And so I came out with a painful loss, meaning I go into the final round with just 3 points out of 6. So going into the final round, my goal was just to win, finish the tournament strong. Hadn't been the best results, but if I can win this game, then at least I'll be have something to celebrate. And I actually got paired surprisingly against a player who was of a similar rating, despite being on not such a good score. I got paired up against another strong player who wasn't having that great of a tournament. A guy in his 50s, actually, so by far the oldest of my opponents throughout this tournament. And he is actually a national master. He broke 2200 back in maybe 2007, 2008, but his rating has fallen since. He's around about 2060. And I knew it was still going to be a tough game. And I got to prepare a little bit for him. I saw that he was going to play this opening, and so I said, okay, this should be fun, because he is one of the very rare people that play the Alekhine defense over the board. A lot of people play this in Blitz, but this is the first time for many years that someone has played this against me over the board. And so I played e5, he goes knight d5, and here's some common moves are like knight f3, sometimes d4, c4, but I surprised him with knight c3, the same-ish attack, which is an opening, or a variation, I should say, that I learned from international master Mio the Butcher, Mio Drag Prunovic. Shout out to him. He made a nice video on this variation against the Alekhine a while back, and I've kind of played a bit in Blitz. And as soon as he saw this move, he was like, oh boy, here we go. Because this is a very kind of irregular way to play against the Alekhine. Basically, black doesn't have to take. He can drop the knight back or defend it, but the most common move is to take, and I take by b pawn, and I've allowed my pawns to be doubled, but in return, I have the open b file, and I have a chance to kind of solidify my pawn chain with d4. So black plays, for example, d6. A lot of times, for example, like a line could go like this. Let's say takes, and white will get the strong center with d4, e5, and the pawn on c3 supporting. But he went for a different approach. He played d5. And now I could play d4 here, and we would get kind of like a French structure. But recently, I've been playing this opening in a little bit different way. By playing f4, knight f3, and delaying the d-pawn push. Not moving that pawn at all yet. Bishop e2, and here I was expecting bishop g4, and we would get some position like this. I've had this in Blitz a couple times, where the idea usually for white is not to play d4, but to play d3 and c4. It's a little bit strange. It's like not a pawn structure that you see in a lot of openings. But he played bishop f5, and I thought, seems a little bit odd. Let's kick his bishop out. So I played knight h4. And he was really unhappy when he saw this. He was like, oh man, I have to either give him my bishop or drop back. So he drops back, and now he's forced to basically play e6, which shuts in his bishop. So I was happy. And then we get this position, and I still haven't played d4. I could play it here, but I thought he just plays c4, and I didn't really like this position for myself. It's kind of like a winnower French, but one where black has their dark square bishop. So I instead played c4, because I had remembered seeing a similar move executed in a game. Like, this variation does not have many games in the database, because, again, it's pretty rare. But I saw this idea before where basically if black plays d4, trying to like control the center, white plays bishop d3, and a lot of times they can even like use this diagonal to kind of attack. So I play c4, he takes though, and then he plays knight a5. And here I was a little bit unhappy because I realized that if I play my bishop to d3, with the idea to put it on e4, he can play bishop c6 and stop me. And now if I play queen e2, again, trying to put the bishop on e4, well, that's a big blunder. Because he can take the knight and then come in with this check, and that's going to hurt. And I had actually thought about moving my rook to b1 earlier, but I decided to kind of like put it off, not do it yet, and now I regretted it because I realized that, yeah, here if I move the rook, he can maybe even play c4 and force the bishop back. Didn't like that either. So I said, okay, bishop back to e2. Passive, but at least we're staying solid. He castles, and here I'm like, okay, what kind of pawn setup do I want to go for? If I play c3, maybe he plays c4, and he kind of like fixes my pawn on d2, because if I go here, he can take en passant, and then I'm left with this weak pawn on c3. Maybe I should have played a4 actually in light of his next move, but I decided to start with d3. And now he came up with a nice move. He played bishop a4, basically preventing me from pushing the c-pawn because now there's this pin. So I just developed. He developed his rook. And now I'm like, all right, this position is kind of unpleasant. If I try to like get out of this pin, then maybe he can rush his c-pawn, and then he can cement his knight into c4, and that's not great either. So I'm like, okay, let's drop the knight back. And then we're going to put the knight on b3, and when he goes to d4, now the knight actually blocks this pin. So I played c3, I allowed him to take my bishop. He comes in with the queen to attack the knight, but I played c4. And he came back with the queen. He was probably thinking that, okay, like, what is this guy doing? He has this terribly ugly pawn on d3. I'm just going to attack it. But then I played rook f3. My idea being that I'm going to defend this pawn by dropping the bishop back, and at the same time, I can swing the rook somewhere to h3 or g3 and start to get an attack on one of these two files. And this proved to be the turning point of the game, because he got a little bit spooked that I would start to attack him, and he played f6, which I think is still a fine move. It kind of tries to trade off my pawn in the center, and I decided to take. And here I was like, okay, is he going to take with the bishop? Because, that looks pretty annoying because it attacks the rook. I'm going to have to move the rook. Is he going to take by rook? That's also possible. Only he took by pawn, which really confused me because he opens up his king. But then I thought, okay, maybe what he wants to do is he wants to put his pawn on f5, controlling the e4 square so I can never land my knight there. And then he wants to play bishop f6 and like dominate that diagonal. For example, check. He'll just get out of the way, and he'll eventually put his bishop here, and this position might not be so bad for black. Now, when I saw this move, though, I said, okay, maybe I can do something quickly to prevent him from playing f5 and kind of setting up that structure. So I thought for a little while, and I played f5 myself. A very interesting pawn break, a little bit risky because I'm sacrificing a pawn, but I figured if he takes, he's not really going to be able to hold on to the pawn. Plus, I'm opening the diagonal for my bishop. That's another important factor. I go here, and then I can start to attack him. Maybe I can bring in the queen. He's going to have to defend his rook somehow. And then I can go here, and then I'm going to try to win the pawn back. And he has to be very careful. He kind of weakened his king side, and now he has to defend it. Except in this position, he made a very strange move. Another thing he could have done was to play e5, but again, I would get the bishop in, and then I thought this would be pretty good for me because eventually I'm going to try to get my knight to e4. I have my rooks in good positions. He spent a little while and he played rook d8, just vacating his king side completely. So, okay, now it's white to move. What should I play here? So I eventually played bishop h6 in this position. Actually, a move that you have to be very careful with, because my idea is to play rook g3 and again try to attack him, but The critical move for black here is bishop takes knight. Because if I simply take the bishop, well then again, queen d4 check, and he is picking up my rook, and that's going to hurt. But the critical intermediate move in this variation is rook g3 check. Because he cannot go to f7 because he just gets mated. And if he goes to h8, where I had to calculate was check, check, discover check from the rook. If he moves his king to f8, then I can actually come back. And at the very least, I can take the bishop now because now the bishop guards d4, so he doesn't have that check. But if he goes to f7, here is where I knew I had something, but I didn't even really fully find the best moves in the game because I knew that once we got to this point, I would be winning. But actually, there's a couple moves to consider. There's this check, and there's this check. But you don't want to give this check because he can take the bishop and the king actually escapes. But the key move here is actually pawn takes pawn. Because after queen takes, now we go check. If he takes, this is going to be mate. And if he goes back, then, again, the king ends up getting mated because all my pieces are coming in and he's just left wide open. So he thought for a very long time after I played bishop h6 in this position. And let me actually see how long he spent. He spent over half an hour, 35 minutes. And eventually he played king h8 because he kind of realized that, he also can't really take the pawn because then I would once again go check. And then I would once again have this check. And then I can take here. And he can't take back because then I have this check, deflecting the king from the defense of the queen. So he basically just had to come to terms with the fact that he's losing a pawn. I take, and now I just have an extra pawn, and it's actually a very strong pawn on e6. But it's still not so easy because, I have kind of a weak structure here with this pawn on d3, this pawn on c4, and his pawn on f6 actually does a good job of shielding this diagonal. So here I just played rook e1. He plays rook g8. I brought my bishop back to attack his queen. He came back. I played rook g3 because I recognized that he has a threat to kind of come back with the bishop and put pressure on my g2 pawn. So I offered him the trade. He decided to actually trade the bishop for the knight. And then he came into the check. I blocked. He put his queen on c3 where he's pressuring my pawns. And here I played rook h3 because I figured, if his queen is going to be off on this side, I'm going to try to attack him on the king side. But I also had a very sneaky idea, which he missed. Because in this position, he needed to play something like rook g7 to kind of fortify his king side. Or maybe rook g6. However, he missed my threat, and he played rook d8. Now white's move, and see if you can find how I finished off this game. So the reason rook to d8 was a big mistake was because he simply allowed a forced checkmate with rook takes h7. Always got to look for those forcing moves, because now king takes, queen check, and queen h6. And as soon as he got mated, he was like, man, I knew I should have played rook g7. Because if he had played rook g7 here, he would have at least stayed alive a little bit longer. Although then I had another idea. I was going to play d4. And if he took, now bishop back to h6 with a double attack. So I was winning in this position, but he definitely sped up the process by allowing a checkmate in 3. And so yeah, I got to end the tournament, at least with that decent win. It was kind of a weird game, a line that you rarely see, and the structure and just the whole flow of the game was very odd to me, but ended in a checkmate in just over 30 moves, so we'll take that. And so yeah, I end the tournament on 4 points out of 7, 3 wins, 2 draws, and 2 losses. Definitely short of my goal, which was 5.5. But live and we learn. Definitely the time management throughout was not the best. The time control was different from what I'm kind of used to playing, so that is part of it. But I definitely got to work on that for future tournaments. So yeah, that's the final recap of this tournament. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you soon for more videos on the channel.